Welcome everybody to the first CEFES JRC webinar on inequality in Europe. My name is Alessandra Michelangeli and I'm the chair of the Inequality in Europe Research Group at CEFES. The title of today's webinar is Reframing Urban and Regional Development for Left Behind Places. The speaker is Professor Andy Pike from Newcastle University. And before introducing the speaker, I leave the floor to Paola Proietti from JRC for her welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and welcome to everybody also from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. For those of you who don't know what the JRC is, it is the Science and Knowledge Service of the European Commission. In particular, I come from the unit of territorial development, so we also do lots of work on territorial inequalities and vulnerable group vis-a-vis the place where they live. So we are really happy to have the chance to listen to Professor Pike and also to actually inform you about also a recent work we have been publishing on something related to what we will discuss today. We recently published a report titled New Perspective on Territorial Disparities from Lonely Places to Places of Opportunities, which is also about trying to have a fresh thinking about alternative approaches to vulnerable places. So I will not take any further time, and I will leave the floor maybe to Alessandra so that we can have the chance to listen to the presentation of today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paola. So I'm going to introduce the speaker. Professor Pike has been director of the Center for Urban and Regional Development and co-director of iBuild Research Center. His research interests mainly focus on regional and urban development, governance, and policy. He has published in the top field journals, and he is presenting today Reframing Urban and Regional Development for Left Behind Places. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alessandra and colleagues. The Centre for European Studies, JRC, delighted to accept the invitation to share some of the work we've been doing on this issue of the left behind people and places that has become very topical in recent years, particularly in the wake of the 2008 crash, where this idea of places hurt by the kind of prevailing political and economic model had somehow risen up and expressed their discontent through the ballot box in ways that we became familiar with in terms of Brexit in the UK, the election of Donald Trump as president in the US, some instances that we'll come back to in a moment. And this kind of term left behind places, if you just use these kind of basic search data from Google, has certainly taken off in that period after 2008, become a much more topical term that has almost become a shorthand, if you like, for geographical inequalities. The people and places at the sharp end of those inequalities are increasingly described as being left behind, and that still seems to have a resonance now, even in that post-pandemic period. And we've been kind of working on this stuff. A few years ago, the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society had a special issue where they put out a call for papers on spatial policy in times of recurring crises and old and new challenges. So we put together a paper with colleagues from CURDS, the Centre for Urban and Regional Development Studies, that was published in that special issue on reframing urban and regional development for left behind places. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of that work, but also some of the way in which that work has developed since that time as part of a broader project we've been involved in with partners in France and Germany on left behind places. And fundamentally, this has really been about trying to open the lid on this term of left behind places. Obviously, it's become this more used currency now, but we're very keen to try and understand what the term actually obscures. You know, there are very many different kinds of left behind places. with different issues, different configurations of problems and concerns, and also too different potentials, different pathways perhaps from being left behind. So that's work that's ongoing with partners in France and Germany and ourselves in the UK, which you can check out in terms of the project website, and there's some downloads, I think, of some of the early working papers from that. The other strand of work that feeds into this is a book we published recently with some colleagues from Cambridge University, Southampton University and Cambridge Econometrics on levelling up left behind places. This was very much a kind of policy-oriented discussion feeding into debates around this so-called levelling up policy agenda in the UK, which again has some potential wider international kind of relevance for discussion and debates and policy around levelling up and addressing this challenge of left behind places. So that's a kind of setup, really, just to give you a flavour of some of the work we've been doing that has fed into this kind of argument and discussion I want to set out today, and hopefully engage in some interesting discussion and respond to questions and critique and so forth. And really what we're, I guess, trying to do is think about how this rise of left behind places has really questioned the whole idea of, well, what does development mean, in inverted commas, for left behind places? And do we need to start rethinking, reframing some of the more conventional approaches that arguably perhaps have failed some of the people and places in different national settings? So the talk is divided into 7 parts. I want to firstly say a few points by way of the kind of introduction and argument. Secondly, to address some questions then about how we define left behind places. Thirdly, to try and make this argument then that much of urban and regional policy has been focused on superstar cities and city regions, and the whole question of what do we do about lagging, declining and left behind places has been somewhat neglected in recent years. And I want to link that then to an argument around reframing what development, in inverted commas, might mean for left behind places. And here, I guess we're arguing that we need to rethink, to perhaps engage more closely with people and places that are in this left behind position to get a better sense of what they might determine or deem development to mean for them. And fifthly, to outline some elements, at least, of a new policy approach at a relatively high level that might attempt to try and understand conventional and so-called alternative approaches to left behind places, and perhaps open a research agenda, a conversation around how these might be better linked and connected with each other to address different kinds of left behind places. Then we'll offer a summary, a few points of conclusions and a few future directions. And I'll attempt to do all that in the next sort of half an hour, 35 minutes or so. Okay, so we're no doubt familiar, as we've noted at the start here, that there's been an international concern with so-called left behind places then. They've become these kind of hotbeds of political discontent and often populist backlash since the 2008 crisis in particular. The idea that globalization, technological change and so forth has been, the benefits have been concentrated in these so-called superstar cities, and left behind places have been somewhat abandoned, overlooked, ignored. And the sharp end of geographical inequalities, the losers, if you like, those that are facing the greater costs from these processes of change, then have been left behind. Now, urban and regional studies has a long history of addressing declining and lagging places, but we would argue in our reading that much of this left behind places problem has been somewhat neglected by this focus on superstar cities and successful models of urban and regional development, so that the development problems then of these left behind places has tended to be left behind with the dominance particularly of ideas around agglomeration and supporting city region focused development. So we're not saying that this isn't important and part of what urban and regional studies should be looking at, but we just think the balance has kind of shifted a little bit too far in that direction. So what we want to try and argue in the paper and in the talk today, and perhaps in the wider project and work we've been doing, is that it's very important for us to try and engage with how we define, how we diagnose this condition of left behind places, and try and use it as a way of opening up what we mean by their development, in inverted commas, because we feel this has been framed in very narrow terms, conventional terms, which perhaps hasn't been beneficial for these kinds of places and policy to try and address them. And part of this reframing, this rethinking what we mean by urban and regional development for these kinds of places is across two elements. One being this idea of broadening to try and go beyond just the economic, to include the social, the environmental, the political dimensions of left behind places. Again, these have come to the fore in recent debates. And also to at least begin what is probably a very challenging and difficult set of research questions and policy responses in connecting with issues around attachment, belonging, and well-being. You know, in particular, this issue about, well, why do people stay in left behind places if their kind of lived experience and their prospects then are somewhat limited? And again, these questions of attachment, belonging, well-being, and so forth, I think are very closely related to that. And also, I think as well, we're trying to actually think through, I guess, how we might, again, broaden our research focus to try and understand more the kind of actually existing social and economic relations and practices then in left behind places. And that's something we've been very actively doing as part of this wider project. So trying to engage with not only stakeholders in the institutions addressing the issues in left behind places, but also with residents as well, trying to get that much more kind of finer grained view, if you like, of the issues and how they're experienced by people who actually live, work, learn, or studying, or are retired and dwelling, if you like, in left behind places. So that's hopefully some work we'll have more to say on into the future. So the second part then is really just to try and grapple with this issue then of what do we mean by left behind places. Certainly in Phil McCann's work, this has been a key element of the so-called geography of discontent, the places that are struggling economically but are expressing their kind of discontent through the ballot box in voting for mostly right populist parties, but sometimes left populist parties too. It's become very topical, as we said at the start, in terms of the kind of locus of geographical inequalities after the crash in 2008. And the idea that prevailing models of globalization, technological change, the prevalence, if you like, of this superstar city regional agglomeration focused models has somehow left behind certain places in different national settings. And crucially as well, this idea that left behind places then brings forth an understanding then of a whole series of multiple and interconnected dimensions. You know, while the problems of left behind places are no doubt economic, they also overlap and interconnect with social, health, cultural, political dimensions, which again have come to represent and create this really quite challenging issue then of how do you address these multiple connected dimensions in left behind places. And as I mentioned before, the motivation for our work with our partners in France and Germany on the Beyond Left Behind Places project was really that we felt the term had now, some 12 years on or so from the crash, come to obscure actually the fact that there are different kinds of left behind places. They have different predicaments, different prospects, and we need a much better understanding, if you like, of what we mean by left behind places to really think about their issues as well as what we might be able to do about them in terms of public policy. And here's one example from Mike Kenny and Diana Coyle's work, where they make a point rather that you've got this conceptualization of left behind places where they talk about a disconnection between the booming economies of cities, which benefit from the effects of new technologies and a highly skilled workforce, and those of left behind areas increasingly experiencing a brain drain as skilled workers migrate away to more desirable locations, with it creating a circular problem. Investment and people increasingly move to wealthier urban areas, others become poorer. So this is an example then of this kind of multiple interconnected issue for left behind places. In the project, we've tried to develop this further to really try and understand the different dimensions that are evident within that broader literature. And across the various dimensions, there are multiple dimensions. They are often interconnected and interrelated with each other. So just without going through the whole table, given the timing, there are economic issues, there are social, environmental, political, cultural, and infrastructural issues. On the economic side, the whole falling real wages, deteriorating living conditions is obviously a key part of it, but it's not only economic. This is linking into social questions of mobility and immobility, of degraded physical environments on the environmental side, the political discontent that we've noted and mentioned already, and also this cultural kind of dimension too, the sense that these kind of places feel backward, overlooked, that they're behind the dominant kind of metropolitan elite views of what development should be about and what aspiration should amount to for people. And lastly as well, the idea of these places being underinvested, a lack of public investment, deteriorating or uneven access to essential local public services. So again, this creates quite a complex, challenging conundrum, of course, which we would argue the idea of left behind places has brought into the view, that these are not just simple, narrow economic problems. They are much more difficult. They're interrelated and connected with these other dimensions of change. Which can be a helpful thing that left behind places as a term brings into the picture, but also obviously a very challenging one in terms of diagnosis and policy response. And we've developing this in other papers at the moment where we actually develop some answers to some of these questions, but clearly in defining left behind places, there's the question about who or what is left behind what. Are we talking about people or places? Is it relative to national averages or a basic kind of floor? These sorts of questions are important. The where and when, the different geographical scales at which this label is applied is often very confusing. Sometimes neighborhoods, sometimes local economy, sometimes regional economy. And the timing of this, is it a situation that is irreversible for places or is it something that's a relatively recent post-crash phenomenon? And thirdly, this idea of causation, what explains this left behind condition that these places are experiencing? And we've been working, I think, with our colleagues in certainly Germany, Thilo Lang and others, with this idea of peripheralization as being a very important process that has been at work in terms of creating and reinforcing these problems of left behind places. And lastly then, and again, we'll touch upon this, what are the institutional and policy corollaries then for left behind places? What are the kind of policy repertoires and agendas that flow from the kind of diagnosis of issues that left behind places are facing? So as I mentioned, we are very interested in the whole question of left behind places. We feel and we've tried to argue that they've been left behind to a degree by urban and regional policy. Certainly in unprecedentedly, arguably very disruptive, uncertain, volatile times since the crash and the Great Recession, the pandemic, of course, from 2020, the Ukraine conflict, inflation, cost of living crisis as well, that's being experienced unevenly across the world. This has kind of hit left behind places that were particularly vulnerable even harder. The idea of economic disadvantage and insecurity, families feeling that the futures for their children will be less prosperous than their own futures, and the kind of cultural resentments that are built up have generated, of course, these populist backlashes of various kinds in different countries. Brexit being one, arguably in the UK, perhaps the national government situation in Italy currently has been part and parcel of the way in which these kind of feelings of discontent have been expressed through the political system. And again, it has a geography to it. The idea that people and places left behind by globalization, technological change have been at the heart of these kinds of disruptions. And as we mentioned, there's a sense that urban and regional studies have been focused on agglomeration, dynamic city regions, the kind of successful models, if you like, that we all apparently should be aspiring to. And while it's been a long history, of course, in urban and regional studies to address geographical inequalities, the balance has shifted somewhat in recent years. And of course, just empirically, as we touched on before, the kind of instances of this populist backlash, of course, going back some 6 years now, over 6 years now, to the presidential election results then in the US, and the whole notion then of these kind of liberal coasts and the flyover states in the middle that were the overlooked, the left behind, that came out even in formerly democratic voting working class communities in favor of Donald Trump's particular brand of republicanism. And again, this kind of stoked up a whole discussion around left behind places in the US context. There is, of course, the wider European question. The work by Lewis Dijkstra and colleagues then have done some wonderful work mapping this kind of geography of discontent across the European Union and European countries, with in particular trying to track, I think, the minimum share then of votes for parties that are strongly opposed to European integration. So European integration being seen as this kind of globalist project of Europe's kind of unification in economic terms and integration, and then projection then into a global political economy. And of course, a very uneven kind of map of discontent across the piece that we can see from that. And then Brexit, of course, we're kind of still experiencing in the UK, some 6 years into the perhaps never-ending process of Brexit. And again, we see a very kind of marked geography to this discontent. Much of the concentrations of Leave votes, the high levels of Leave vote in the dark blue being so-called left behind places, ones that were economically challenged through either rural marginalisation or post-industrial change and deindustrialisation, again turning towards the ballot box to vote for Brexit and leaving the European Union, when of course the problems that were evident in their particular places were much more complex and interconnected. And of course this had a general election kind of impact then from the 2019 general election in the UK, which elected Boris Johnson's Conservative government. And if you see in the far left-hand map, there's the 2017 general election results. The blue are the Conservative, the red are Labour. If we just focus on England, and you can see then that by the 2019 results, then the red wall, as it was so called, much of it had flipped over to blue, to Conservative. And this was a lot of Labour heartlands that had voted Conservative for the first time on the back of Brexit, or feeling this discontent and feeling that Boris Johnson, with his project of levelling up and trying to spread opportunity and prosperity around the country, would actually serve them well into the future. It's a whole other talk to say anything about where the UK has come from in the period since 2019, but perhaps we can get into that in discussion. It's been a turbulent few months in the UK. And of course, Andreas Rodriguez-Pose, we've worked with on and off for many years now, captured this wonderfully in his term, the revenge of the places that don't matter. So this was the idea that the left behind places, through this kind of disruptive political voting for populist parties, then had actually blown up in the face, if you like, of the conventional economic models and political models, which has become, I think from when he wrote this back in 2018, now he's even talking to the likes of McKinsey, who have taken an interest then in these places that don't matter and left behind places. So it truly has become a kind of global phenomenon in terms of what and how left behind places are understood in terms of their issues and concerns, but crucially as well, how public policy and political institutions and politicians try and formulate some responses to deal with their concerns. Now, of course, much of the existing kind of work, if you like, that we argue has not really been paying as much attention as it should have to left behind places, has been focused on a range of problems. And the first one, I suppose, is really the kind of narrow conception that the problems of left behind places can just be reduced to purely economic questions. They're not productive, they don't grow. It's a worry about GDP and productivity. Now, of course it is. In many of these left behind places, there are concerns in this regard. but it's not only ever about the economy. I think this is one of the fundamental issues. And also, arguably, the issue is not just about solving the economic dimension of left behind places and hoping that everything else will fall into place. As we've suggested, left behind places face a number of multiple and interconnected dimensions that are certainly economic, but they're not only economic. And I think this is one of the important and arguably most challenging things about addressing their particular issues. We would also argue too, perhaps, that much of the existing work has been very focused then on the tradable competitive sector of the economy. So trying to get export-oriented firms producing goods and services into these places as a means of spurring productivity and growth and employment, investment, and living standards improvement. We've made the point already about how the existing kind of urban and regional studies models of dynamic and prosperous city regions and their replication is the idea, city centrism. So often the solution for many of these left behind places is just to put in place better transport links to these more dynamic urban centres, which again, addresses some of the problem, but can't be expected to provide a kind of silver bullet or a fix for these things. Another point being the idea that often the question is about relative immobility. So why is it that people facing challenging living standards and uneven access to public services then should be encouraged to move? Why are they staying in these places? And this becomes a policy conundrum, often put down to issues around their kind of lack of skills, lack of motivation to be able to move to places where there are job opportunities, which of course raises a whole series of problematic questions. And then lastly, then the point that really perhaps urban and regional studies has paid not enough attention to the economic potential then in lagging and declining regions, which perhaps could be valorized in certain ways, perhaps not only economic, in terms of feeding into their well-being and development, however they choose to define it. Okay, so what we've tried to do then is obviously to recognise left behind places as being a fundamental issue then for urban and regional studies. We've tried to make this argument that it's been relatively neglected as an issue while it has become much more important. And we tried to suggest as well that it has multiple and interconnected dimensions and has been neglected in ways in urban and regional studies that really sort of prompts us and encourages us to try and think a bit differently about left behind places and the whole question of geographical inequalities. So when we argue about reframing, rethinking an urban and regional development, these are really the motivations for why we're suggesting that. So moving on to this idea of, okay, well, if we want to reframe or rethink development, then what are we saying? Where are we going with this? And I think one of the things that Left Behind Places brings, which is very helpful, is to question, to open up what we mean by the economy, what we mean by development for people and places, and to try and engage perhaps more with their visions, their values, their potentials, rather than imposing this kind of top-down conventional view of it's about employment rates and productivity and export-based businesses. Some of these remedies from conventional policy perhaps will never be appropriate for some of these kinds of places and the people dwelling within them. And we've been inspired a little bit by what Ray calls this neo-endogenous development approach, and perhaps some of the ways in which countries of the global south have been trying to address these kinds of development challenges. I'll say more about this now in a moment. And also, I think trying to learn from the way in which Left Behind Places widens the frame from beyond, including the economic, but widening it beyond that to try and address some of the wider kind of dimensions and their interconnections within Left Behind Places, as we introduced earlier. And of course, one of the other things here, as we're saying, to try and broaden the frame, better connect then to social, environmental, even cultural and political dimensions. Picking up on Martin Sambu's book about attachment and belonging, to try and recognise that. And again, I think that's a very challenging and difficult area to try and address for urban and regional studies. And perhaps, as Simona Marino and colleagues have suggested, then trying to get more people and place sensitive approaches rather than having this kind of old binary between focusing on people or focusing on places. And I think Martin Sambu's work is very interesting in this regard. Martin Sambu is a columnist, a writer for the Financial Times, the international publication, and he wrote a very interesting book, again, connecting with these wider debates about left behind places, called The Economics of Belonging, a radical plan to win back the left behind and achieve prosperity for all. And he had a very interesting set of ideas in that about trying to understand what connects people to places, the complex relations then between economy, society, ecology, polity, and culture, and how these ideas of attachment and belonging are, quite difficult, quite hard to understand, particularly for sort of mainstream urban and regional studies, but they do open up a different dimension in terms of trying to understand the challenges for left behind places. So I'd recommend having a look at that book. It's a very interesting read. I think there are lots of challenges in addressing these dimensions. Again, we might have a chance to discuss, but they certainly are part of that picture and part of the complexity, I think, of dealing with the overlapping and connected elements then within left behind places. So what do we mean then by the ideas, if we're reframing, rethinking left behind places and how we might address them? Let us think then about how that might connect in then to a new policy approach. And I guess here what we're really thinking about is providing some inspiration and opening up a research agenda. I don't think we have all the answers at all. I think we're just beginning to maybe scope out the complexity and challenge of the issues, excuse me, but also trying to begin to think about how we might proceed to develop some policy approaches for rethinking, reframing left behind places. So we're inspired here a little bit, I suppose, by trying to think, well, okay, we still need conventional type approaches, whether that be innovation policy or policy focused on upgrading skills in labour markets, of transport and infrastructure investment, all these kind of staples of urban and regional studies and policy intervention. But we think those conventional approaches perhaps do need to be kind of connected and better linked in with some alternative approaches. So rather seeing this as some kind of zero-sum game, that you've got some places that we should just have a conventional policy repertoire for, whereas other places, the conventional policy will never work, therefore we need alternatives. I think there's a fruitful ground perhaps to think about potential linkages between these two policy areas. We're inspired a little by some work. I think they've been quite active in the Italian setting too, around the foundational economy, the Foundational Economy Collective, which have been introducing some very interesting ideas around the multiple notion of economy and trying to open up understandings then of the different kinds of services locally. We'll touch upon that in a moment. And in particular, I think trying to get a more geographical understanding of some of those foundational economy ideas, I think is quite a promising research agenda, which would hopefully open up some opportunities for some policy ideas. And also, as I mentioned then, Ray's idea of this neo-endogenous development policy. So something that is not only focused upon local relations, assets, resources, and agency, but also connects it in meaningful ways to extra local relations, assets, resources, and agency. So trying to sort of meld the inside and outside of these left behind places to address their questions of development. Again, however they wish to define those development ideas. You'll be perhaps familiar with some of the ideas from the Foundational Economy Collective. They have this zonal schema of the economy. They talk about a tradable economy, which is the kind of conventional bit of export firms and producing goods and services. They also argue about what they call an overlooked economy, these more mundane services of haircuts, sofa production, holidays. And then they also focused and introduced a real emphasis upon what they term the foundational economy, which they define then as these material, these providential essentials that provide the kind of basic services, if you like, and infrastructures of everyday life. You know, the kinds of things that are essential, if you like, for civilized living in a particular place. So things like energy, water, education, and health. And then they talk about the core economy of family and community. So again, this is trying to sort of rethink, to kind of give a new slant or view, if you like, for thinking about economy, particularly in those left behind places, which again might struggle with turning themselves into internationally competitive, tradable local economies. Within their broader framework, again, we have suggested that there needs to be quite a bit more attention to the missing geography within the foundational economy. Certainly, they make a distinction between what they call providential services. So these are often the critical local public services around education, of health, security, care, culture, sport and leisure. And then the material services, those kind of basic infrastructures, if you like, that provide those important goods and services for everyday life: energy, waste, water, banking, broadband, food, housing, and public transport. But the big issues, of course, are the extent to which these different kinds of services then are geographically universal. Are they available and accessible at similar prices and qualities across a territory? Or are they geographically differentiated? And there is uneven access to providential material services. We'd argue they are very uneven, through the nature of how perhaps austerity has had uneven impacts upon state resources and collective provision in places, and also the way in which national state policies have obviously emphasised particular forms of collective service provision in certain places rather than others. Going back to that point about left behind places feeling underinvested in public transport terms, for example, we think is an important part of this. So again, as part of feeding into that reframing, rethinking development in left behind places, we feel there's a lot of promise in taking this geographical perspective then to the foundational economy. And again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these ideas and may even be working on them. So it'd be interesting to hear about that in the discussion. The other side as well, I think we've been very keen to try and sort of think about, well, okay, it's all very well calling for neo-endogenous development policy then that might be helpful for left behind places, but what might that look like? How might that be articulated? And here, I guess we've tried to just focus on two key dimensions, the economic and the social, recognizing that there are environmental, there are health, there are political and cultural dimensions to left behind places too, but trying to start with some of the sort of basic economic and social dimensions. There are clearly a set of conventional approaches but on the economic side around GDP, GVA, productivity, innovation, hard infrastructure. Yeah, that's the conventional sort of policy repertoire. There's clearly, perhaps post-pandemic, a growing emphasis upon conventional social policy, certainly in terms of employment, spreading innovation benefits, soft infrastructure, social infrastructure, everyday life, essential workers of health, of education, so forth, as being very important. And then you've got a whole series of alternative kind of approaches which have been flowering, certainly on the economic side, the idea of the social economy, livelihoods approach, even approaches to degrowth or post-growth kind of approaches. You could argue things like inclusive growth start to emerge from that. And also alternatives in terms of the social side as well, well-being. As we mentioned, Martin Sambu's book about attachment and belonging, social innovation, social reproduction, community development. These are all kind of sometimes long-standing, sometimes newer kind of issues that have been brought to the fore. And of course, these things, we put them in a matrix, but the argument, of course, is trying to think through, well, how might you articulate and bring these things together, the conventional and the alternative being linked in creative and innovative ways to try and address some of these multiple and connected elements then in left behind places. And arguably a lot of the kind of emergent work, and it is quite a kind of wide, expanding and confusing field, you might argue. And again, there's another task if somebody would like to tackle it, of trying to relate and kind of look across these different approaches around next system economics and community wealth building coming out of the Democracy Collaborative in the States, Kate Rayworth's work on donut economics, the foundational economy stuff we've mentioned, the work of Chris Benner and others around inclusive economies, the whole inclusive growth, inclusive innovation field that again has been growing very rapidly, the emphasis upon social infrastructure and the well-being economy. There's a whole host of these kind of beyond GDP type ideas and frameworks and initiatives, which again have sort of flowered in a very plural, exciting, energetic kind of way. But again, what we're interested in, I suppose, is trying to work through, well, in what ways might some of these alternative ideas actually be able to be pulled together as part of this sort of neo-endogenous development policy for left behind places to provide some fruitful and promising combinations of both conventional and alternative kinds of approaches. So again, just to emphasize, we're trying to sketch the field out, the field of ideas that might help us address these multiple and interconnected problems in different kinds of left behind places, rather than presenting a kind of fully worked up policy agenda. And it might be that there isn't one. It might be that it is much more of a plural kind of bricolage, if you like, of multiple ideas that are brought together in different ways by different actors in different places. But again, perhaps we can come back to those sort of implications in the questions and discussion. Okay, so last couple of slides then, and then we can hopefully have some time for some questions and some discussion. So what we try to argue in the talk is we feel left behind places then have been neglected by urban and regional development theory and policy. We've tried to argue that left behind places has grown, become very important in the post-2008 crash period then, which has been helpful for bringing questions of geographical inequality back into the political debate and agenda. And they've also been helpful in raising this question of multiple and interconnected dimensions. So acknowledging there are often economic problems at the core of left behind places, but these also link in with wider social, environmental, political and cultural dimensions too. We've suggested then that these two elements mean that we need to rethink, reframe some of the ways in which urban and regional development theory and policy then is thinking about these sorts of places. And we try to suggest some of the ways in which the conventional, the alternative ideas might be brought together to provide a more fruitful research and policy development agenda into the future. And finally, of course, there are some concerns and issues then by way of conclusion. We have seen lots and lots of very interesting, innovative local experimentation in many of these left behind places, some of which has been inspirational and highly imaginative in terms of addressing their particular concerns. But there is the big question of how these might be scaled up to reach more people, more places to try and address the problems they confront. The second one, and again, this becomes more difficult in a complex set of multiple ideas and multiple interventions, is how do we monitor and evaluate this kind of set of policy interventions to try and support mutual learning, building up knowledge and evidence about what works, what doesn't work in particular settings. And then lastly, the whole idea of the critiques. And again, hopefully we'll get into a bit of this discussion now with the questions. Are we broadening urban regional development so much that it's becoming incoherent? Are we turning economic into social policy, in terms of diluting and moving its aims in a different direction? Are we suggesting a whole series of alternative approaches that might prove to be undeliverable in certain places? Are they designed to fail in some ways because local knowledge and capacity in left behind places are often lacking to think up imaginative ideas around what development means and how policy interventions might be brought to bear to address some of the challenges left behind places face? So thanks very much, Alessandra. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion, and thanks very much for your attention. I'll stop sharing.